When 29-year-old Elena Torres signed away her rights to contest her late aunt's will, she expected nothing more than a rusted piece of railroad history collecting dust in an Arizona rail yard. But hidden within the ornate mahogany walls of a 1920s Pullman sleeper car lay a collection of letters, photographs, and documents that would expose a forgotten chapter of American labor history and reunite families separated for nearly 8 decades. What began as an unwanted burden would become Elena's fight to restore justice to hundreds of forgotten workers and their descendants, a discovery so profound that when she finally understood what her aunt had protected all these years, Elena would stand in that train car and weep for the courage of strangers she'd never meet. Before we dive into this incredible story, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if stories like this touch your heart, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I've got something even more powerful lined up for you. The reluctant heir. The Phoenix sun beat down mercilessly on the abandoned rail yard on the outskirts of Maricopa as Elena Torres pulled her aging Honda Civic into the gravel parking lot. The temperature gauge on her dashboard read 107 degrees, typical for late June in Arizona, and her car's struggling air conditioner did little to combat the oppressive heat that seemed to rise in visible waves from the cracked asphalt. Before her stretched 3 acres of rusted tracks, forgotten freight cars, and the skeletal remains of what had once been a thriving railroad maintenance depot. Weeds pushed through the gravel. Paint peeled from abandoned structures. Chain-link fencing, topped with rusted barbed wire, encircled the perimeter like a prison for obsolete machinery. Somewhere in this graveyard of steel and memories sat the inheritance that had complicated her already difficult life. Elena sat in her car for a long moment, engine still running to maintain the last vestiges of cool air, staring at the weathered sign that read Castellano Rail Storage and Salvage. She'd driven 2 hours from her cramped studio apartment in Tempe to deal with this unexpected complication, time she couldn't really afford to lose when she had a constitutional law exam in 3 days and a stack of case files to review for her paralegal job at Henderson and Associates. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother, "Don't waste your time on Rosa's junk. Just sign it over to the salvage yard and be done with it." Elena didn't respond. Her relationship with her mother, Maria Torres, had been strained for years, but the mention of Aunt Rosalinda always brought a particular edge to her mother's voice, a combination of anger, resentment, and something else Elena had never quite been able to identify. She finally shut off the engine and stepped out into the brutal heat. Immediately, sweat began to bead on her forehead. She grabbed her leather messenger bag from the passenger seat, a graduation gift from her undergraduate days at Arizona State University, now worn and cracking at the edges but still functional, and made her way toward the small office building near the entrance. Elena hadn't spoken to her Aunt Rosalinda in over a decade, a family rift that had started when Elena was just 18, during a heated argument at her grandmother's house. The details were fuzzy now, buried under years of silence and stubborn pride. Elena remembered raised voices, her mother and aunt screaming at each other in rapid Spanish, her grandmother crying, and then Aunt Rosa storming out. After that day, Rosa had been erased from family gatherings, her name spoken only in bitter whispers or not at all. Now, at 29, working 50-hour weeks as a paralegal while taking night classes to finish her law degree, Elena had neither the time nor the emotional energy to deal with whatever eccentric legacy her aunt had left behind. Yet here she was, because the alternative, ignoring the inheritance, came with legal complications she couldn't afford. The attorney's letter. The attorney's letter had arrived 2 weeks ago, forwarded through 3 previous addresses before finally catching up with Elena at her current residence. She'd nearly thrown it away, assuming it was another student loan notice or collection agency correspondence. But the law firm's name, Blackwood & Chen, attorneys at law, based in Scottsdale, had caught her attention. The letter had been maddeningly vague. Dear Ms. Elena Torres, we regret to inform you of the passing of your aunt, Rosalinda Maria Torres, on May 3rd. As the executor of Ms. Torres's estate, I am writing to notify you that you have been named as the sole beneficiary of her most prized possession. Specifically, you are to inherit Pullman's sleeping car number 47, designated La Estrella del Desierto, the Desert Star, currently housed at Castellano Rail Storage and Salvage in Maricopa, Arizona. This vintage railroad car, manufactured in 1924, has been maintained at the facility for the past 20 years under a rental agreement that expires on July 31st. Please arrange for its removal, sale, or continuation of the storage agreement within 60 days of this notice, or the rail yard will dispose of it as abandoned property in accordance with Arizona state law. All documentation regarding ownership and historical registration is available at the rail yard office. Per your aunt's instructions, I am to inform you that the truth is in the walls, and the walls remember everything. Should you have questions regarding this inheritance, please contact our office. Sincerely, Margaret Chen, Esq. A train car. Her aunt had left her a train car. Elena had immediately Googled Pullman's sleeping car value and found widely varying information. Some fully restored vintage Pullman cars sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars to collectors or restaurants looking for unique dining experiences. Others, in poor condition, were worth scrap metal value, maybe a few $1,000s at best. The cryptic message, "The truth is in the walls, and the walls remember everything," had stuck with Elena. It sounded like something her aunt would say. Rosa had always been dramatic, speaking in riddles and metaphors that frustrated the more practical members of the Torres family. Elena's financial situation was precarious at best. Student loans totaling $68,000 from her undergraduate degree and 2 years of law school. Credit card debt exceeding $15,000, mostly from her mother's recent medical bills when Maria had been hospitalized with pneumonia and had no insurance. Rent on a studio apartment in Tempe that ate up most of her paralegal salary. She'd been living on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches for months, trying to make ends meet while finishing her law degree. She'd been hoping for something she could quickly sell: jewelry, furniture, maybe some savings bonds or a small bank account. Instead, she'd inherited what was likely a worthless hunk of metal that would cost more to move than it was worth. Unless, of course, it was one of those rare, fully restored vintage cars worth serious money. In which case, it could be the answer to all her financial problems. That possibility, however slim, was why she'd driven 2 hours into the desert on her only day off in 2 weeks. Her mother had been no help when Elena called seeking information. In fact, Maria Torres had been actively discouraging. "Your aunt was always obsessed with that stupid train car," Maria had said with barely concealed bitterness when Elena mentioned the inheritance. "She spent every penny restoring it instead of helping family when we needed her. When your grandmother got sick, when I lost my job, when you needed money for college, Rosa always had an excuse. But she had money for that piece of junk. What do you know about the car itself?" Elena had pressed. "Is it valuable?" "How should I know? I never went to see it. Your aunt chose that train car over all of us. She became obsessed with it after your grandmother died, spent all her time at that rail yard, ignoring her family, researching old railroad history like it mattered more than real people." But there had been something else in her mother's voice, something Elena couldn't quite identify. Not just anger, but fear. Or perhaps guilt. And when Elena had mentioned the attorney's cryptic message about truth in the walls, her mother had fallen silent for a long moment before abruptly changing the subject. Elena's grandmother, Isabella Torres, had mentioned the train car only once before she passed 5 years ago. They'd been looking through old family photos, a lazy Sunday afternoon ritual that Elena cherished during her visits home from college. Abuela's small apartment in Phoenix had always smelled like canela and fresh tortillas, a comforting scent that meant safety and unconditional love. They'd been laughing over pictures from the 1970s, terrible fashion choices, enormous hairstyles, when Isabella had suddenly grown quiet. She was staring at a faded photograph that had fallen from between the pages of the album. It showed a young woman, perhaps in her 20s, standing beside a gleaming passenger train car. She wore a dark uniform and stood with proud posture, a slight smile on her face. "Who is that, Abuela?" Elena had asked. Her grandmother's hands had trembled as she held the photograph. Her eyes filled with tears. "My mother," she'd whispered in Spanish. "Your great-grandmother, Guadalupe." Elena had leaned closer, fascinated. She'd never seen a photo of her great-grandmother, who had died long before Elena was born. She worked on the trains? Isabella had nodded, still staring at the photograph. She was a Pullman maid. She cleaned the sleeping cars, made the beds, took care of the passengers. Her voice had grown distant, as if speaking from across decades. She was proud of that work. It was hard, but it was honest, and it paid better than anything else available to Mexican women in those days. What happened to her? Elena had asked gently. Her grandmother had looked up then, her dark eyes filled with pain. Some stories are too painful to remember, she'd whispered. But too important to forget. Elena had pressed for details, sensing this was important, but her grandmother had simply shaken her head, carefully returned the photograph to the album, and changed the subject. She'd died 3 months later, taking whatever story she'd been protecting to the grave. Now, standing in this forgotten rail yard under the brutal Arizona sun, Elena wondered if that story was somehow connected to the train car her aunt had spent 20 years obsessing over. The yard manager. The office was a small, air-conditioned relief from the oppressive heat. Inside, a cluttered desk was covered with papers, old railroad maps, and faded photographs of trains from various eras. The walls were decorated with vintage railroad signs and memorabilia. An ancient desktop computer hummed in the corner, its screen displaying what looked like inventory management software from the 1990s. "Can I help you?" The voice came from a back room. "I'm looking for Frank Castellano," Elena called out. "I'm here about Pullman car number 47. A man emerged from the back office, weathered and lean, probably in his mid-60s, with sun-damaged skin that spoke of decades working outdoors. He wore faded jeans, work boots, and a t-shirt advertising a railroad museum in Colorado. His eyes, a startling blue against his tan face, assessed Elena with the practiced gaze of someone who'd spent a lifetime evaluating strangers. "You're here about Rosa's car," he said. It wasn't a question. "Elena Torres. I'm her niece. She left it to me." Frank's expression softened immediately, transforming from wary to genuinely sympathetic. "I heard about Rosa's passing. I'm sorry for your loss. She was a good woman. Eccentric, maybe, but she loved that car more than anything." He gestured for Elena to sit in one of the worn office chairs while he settled behind his desk. "Rosa was one of my best customers. Never late on rent, never caused problems. She'd come here every weekend for years, working on that car. Rain or shine, summer heat or winter cold, she was here." "How long?" Elena asked. 20 years, near as I can figure. She bought the car at auction in 2003, got it for a song because nobody else wanted it. Thing was in rough shape back then. Windows broken, interior stripped, rust everywhere. But Rosa saw something in it. Frank pulled out a battered photo album from a desk drawer and opened it to show Elena. The photographs showed the Pullman car in various stages of restoration. In early photos, it was indeed a wreck, paint peeling, windows missing, the entire structure listing slightly on deteriorated wheel assemblies. Subsequent photos showed gradual improvement, new paint, restored windows, replaced fixtures. "She did all this herself?" Elena asked, amazed. "Most of it. She hired specialists for the really technical stuff, wheel restoration, brake systems, that kind of thing. But the interior work, the woodwork, the upholstery, that was all Rosa. She taught herself carpentry, metalwork, even how to work with the specific materials they used in the 1920s. She was determined to make it historically accurate." Frank turned more pages, and Elena saw photographs of her aunt, a woman she barely remembered, working on the train car. In some photos, Rosa was sanding wood panels, sawdust in her gray hair. In others, she was painting carefully, or installing brass fixtures, or studying historical documents spread across a makeshift workbench. Why was she so obsessed with it? Elena asked. Frank closed the album and leaned back in his chair. She never fully explained. But I got the impression it was personal. Not just about preserving history, but about preserving a specific story. She spent years researching this particular car, where it traveled, who worked on it, what routes it served. She made trips to libraries, historical societies, even the National Archives. Did she tell you what she found? Bits and pieces. The car was built in 1924 by the Pullman Company in Chicago. It served the Southern Pacific Railroad, running routes between Los Angeles and El Paso, sometimes down into Mexico. It was retired from service in 1943, sold off to various private owners, and eventually ended up abandoned in this rail yard. Frank paused, choosing his words carefully. But Rosa said the car's official history was incomplete. She said there were stories that had been deliberately erased, people who'd been forgotten on purpose. She called it a witness to things nobody wanted to remember. A chill ran down Elena's spine despite the desert heat. What kind of things? She never said exactly. But toward the end, the last few times I saw her, she was agitated. Worried. She kept saying she needed to finish documenting everything, needed to make sure the evidence was preserved. She said powerful people had worked hard to bury this story, and she couldn't let them succeed. What people? Frank shrugged helplessly. I don't know. She was getting paranoid, maybe. Or maybe she really had uncovered something. Hard to say. But I'll tell you this, Rosa was sharp as a tack right up until the end. Heart attack took her suddenly. She didn't have dementia or anything like that. If she said something was buried, I believed her. The first viewing. Frank handed Elena a folder thick with documents. This is all the paperwork: deed of ownership, rail yard rental agreement paid through the end of next month, historical registration, insurance documents, and Rosa's restoration records. Everything you need to prove ownership or sell it if that's what you decide. Elena flipped through the papers, her paralegal training automatically analyzing the legal language. The maintenance costs alone would be substantial. The rail yard charged $800 per month for storage. Insurance was another $150 monthly. Any additional preservation work would cost thousands. She was looking at over $10,000 annually just to keep this thing, not counting unexpected repairs or restoration work. She couldn't afford it. Not even close. Can I see the car? She asked. Of course. Come on. Frank led her out of the air-conditioned office back into the oppressive heat. They walked through the maze of abandoned rail equipment, freight cars with their paint oxidized to abstract patterns, passenger cars with shattered windows, tanker cars covered in graffiti. The place felt like a cemetery, each piece of equipment a tombstone marking the death of an era. Rosa's car is kept in the back section, Frank explained as they navigated the narrow pathways between rusted metal. I keep the more valuable pieces away from the street side. Less chance of vandalism. They walked for several minutes, the gravel crunching under their feet, the sun beating down relentlessly. Elena could feel sweat running down her back, her blouse sticking to her skin. She regretted wearing professional attire, she should have anticipated this would be an outdoor expedition. Frank kept up a running commentary as they walked. Your aunt was particular about the car's location. She wanted it where she could work in relative privacy. Sometimes she'd spend entire weekends out here, sleeping in the car even, just to be close to her work. She slept in it. Sometimes. I installed a generator connection for her, and she had a small space heater for winter nights. She was dedicated, I'll give her that. They rounded a corner past a line of stripped freight cars, and suddenly Elena saw it. Pullman's sleeping car number 47 sat on a restored section of track, separated from the surrounding deterioration like a jewel in a junkyard. While everything around it spoke of abandonment and decay, this car gleamed in the desert sun. Elena stopped in her tracks, stunned. The car was magnificent. Deep burgundy paint, immaculately maintained, with gold lettering along the side that read La Estrella del Desierto in elegant script. The windows were intact, not just intact, but sparkling clean. Brass fixtures along the exterior gleamed as if freshly polished. The car sat on restored wheel assemblies that looked functional, and even the connecting mechanisms at each end appeared to be in working order. This wasn't junk. This was a masterpiece. My God, Elena whispered. Your aunt's life work, Frank said quietly. Whatever else was going on in her life, she made sure this car survived. Elena approached slowly, almost reverently. The car was approximately 80 feet long, with the classic lines of 1920s luxury rail travel. Small ventilation grates near the roofline. A narrow observation platform at each end. The burgundy paint was so perfectly applied it could have been done yesterday, not decades ago. She ran her hand along the side of the car, feeling the smoothness of the paint, the warmth of the metal underneath that had absorbed the desert sun. Her aunt had touched these same surfaces, had poured 20 years of her life into this restoration. "Ready to see inside?" Frank asked, producing a key from his pocket. The entrance was at the rear of the car, accessed by climbing a short set of metal stairs to the observation platform. Frank unlocked the door, a heavy wooden door with an ornate brass handle, and gestured for Elena to enter first. Stepping into history. The interior took Elena's breath away. She'd expected a gutted shell, or perhaps a partially restored space with obvious gaps and missing pieces. Instead, she stepped into a perfectly preserved 1920s luxury train car that looked as if passengers might arrive at any moment. The entrance opened into a narrow corridor running the length of the car. Rich mahogany paneling lined the walls, glowing with a deep, warm patina. Ornate brass fixtures, light sconces, luggage racks, door handles, decorated every surface. The ceiling was pressed tin, painted cream with intricate scrollwork patterns highlighted in gold leaf. To the left were the sleeping berths, a dozen private compartments, each with its own sliding door. Elena peeked into the nearest one. Inside was a narrow sleeping area with a fold-down bed covered in burgundy velvet upholstery. A small sink with brass fixtures. A mirror with an elaborate frame. A folding table. Even fresh linens that looked as if they'd been placed there recently. She maintained everything, Frank said from behind her. Changed the linen seasonally, polished the brass monthly. She wanted it to be ready. Ready for what? She never said. But she was waiting for something. Or someone. Elena continued down the corridor, examining each compartment. They were all identical, all perfectly maintained. The attention to detail was staggering, period-appropriate reading lamps, authentic luggage racks, even small artwork on the walls showing desert landscapes. At the center of the car was a small common area with facing bench seats upholstered in the same burgundy velvet. Between them was a fold-down table where passengers would have taken meals or played cards. The windows here were larger, offering views of the rail yard, though Elena imagined they'd once framed sweeping desert vistas as the train rolled across the southwest. The far end of the car held what would have been the maid's station, a tiny workspace where the Pullman porters and maids would have prepared linens, stored cleaning supplies, and taken brief rest breaks during their shifts. This area was less ornate than the passenger sections, but still carefully restored. A simple wooden counter. Storage cabinets with brass latches. A small sink. On the counter was a leather-bound journal, and next to it, a small framed photograph. Elena picked up the photograph first. It showed a young woman in a dark uniform standing beside a train car. Not this car, but one similar. The woman smiled slightly at the camera, her posture proud. It was the same photograph Elena had seen years ago in her grandmother's album. Her great-grandmother, Guadalupe. She worked on these cars, Elena said softly, understanding suddenly clicking into place. That's why Aunt Rosa was obsessed with this. It wasn't random. It was family history. Frank nodded. I think so. Though Rosa never explained the full connection. She kept a lot of her research private. Elena picked up the leather journal. The cover was embossed with her aunt's initials, R&T. Inside, the pages were filled with meticulous handwriting, notes, dates, names, sketches of the car's layout, and copies of historical documents. She flipped to the first page. An entry dated January 15, 2004. I bought it today. Car number 47, La Estrella del Desierto. The auctioneer looked at me like I was crazy, bidding $12,000 on what he called a hunk of scrap metal. He doesn't understand. This isn't just a train car. It's a time capsule. It's evidence. It's the last physical witness to what happened. Mama never told me the full story before she died. Just fragments, whispers, warnings to let the past stay buried. But I can't. Guadalupe deserves better. They all deserve better. The truth is in the walls. I know it. I can feel it. 20 years of searching through archives, reading newspapers, interviewing the few surviving witnesses, it all points to this car. This specific car. I'm going to restore it. And I'm going to find what's hidden inside. And then, when I'm gone, someone will inherit this. Someone who'll know what to do with what I found. I hope it's Elena. She's smart, stubborn, and she cares about justice. If she finds this journal, if she finds what's in the walls, she'll understand why I gave up everything else for this. Elena's hands trembled as she read her aunt's words. The journal continued with detailed restoration plans, expenses, and ongoing research notes. But it was that first entry that struck her, written nearly 20 years ago, already planning for Elena to inherit this burden. "Did you know about this?" she asked Frank, holding up the journal. He shook his head. Rosa kept most of her writing private. I knew she was documenting the restoration, but I never read her journals. Elena flipped forward, scanning entries. Most were technical, notes about wood restoration techniques, sources for authentic brass fixtures, consultations with Pullman car historians. But scattered throughout were more personal entries that hinted at the deeper mystery. An entry from 2007 found the Southern Pacific Railroad employment records at the Arizona Historical Society. Guadalupe Torres listed as Pullman maid, car number 47 from 1926 to 1929. Then nothing. She disappears from all records. Why? An entry from 2011, interview with Margaret Whitmore, age 94, former Pullman porter. She remembers the strikes of 1929. Says there were things that happened that were never reported in the newspapers. Says Mexican workers were treated even worse than black workers, but their stories were never told because they were afraid of deportation. She won't say more. Too afraid, even now. An entry from 2018, getting closer. Found references in Union documents to the Desert Star incident. Whatever happened wasn't officially reported, but it caused changes in company policy. Going to request documents from Pullman Company archives in Chicago. The most recent entry was dated just 2 weeks before her aunt's death. I found it. Everything. It's worse than I imagined, but also more important. The evidence is preserved in the walls. I made sure of that. I've made arrangements for Elena to inherit the car. She'll know what to do. To whoever reads this, the panels in the 7th sleeping compartment, left side, hide a sealed compartment. Behind the compartment is everything: letters, photographs, employment records, testimony that was never heard. It's the story of what happened to 37 Pullman maids in September 1929. Their story. Guadalupe's story. The truth is in the walls, and the walls remember everything. Elena felt her heart racing. She looked up at Frank. The 7th compartment. Let's go. The modified panels. They walked back through the car, counting compartments. Elena's hands shook slightly as she opened the door to the 7th sleeping berth on the left side of the corridor. Inside, it looked identical to all the others. Rich mahogany panels, brass fixtures, velvet upholstery. But now, looking more carefully with her paralegal's eye for detail, Elena noticed what she'd missed before. Some panels had slightly different grain patterns. The finish on certain sections was imperceptibly varied from the others, not visible unless you knew to look for it. The brass screws holding certain panels in place were subtly newer than their neighbors, their heads less worn. These panels have been removed and replaced, Elena said, running her fingers along the seams. Recently. Your aunt's work, Frank confirmed. She was very careful. Wanted everything to look original, but she modified certain areas for preservation purposes, I guess. Elena examined the panels more closely. Her aunt had been clever, the modifications were nearly invisible. Unless you knew to look for them, you'd never notice that several panels were actually removable sections cleverly disguised as permanent fixtures. "I need tools," Elena said. "Something to remove these panels without damaging them." Frank nodded. "I have a kit in my office. Original Pullman brass screws and restoration tools. Your aunt left them here. I'll be right back." While Frank retrieved the tools, Elena sat on the velvet bench in the compartment, her mind racing. What had her aunt discovered? What happened to 37 Pullman maids in September 1929? And why had this story been buried for nearly a century? She thought about her great-grandmother Guadalupe, whose photograph smiled from the maid's station. A woman Elena had never known, whose story had been lost to time and family silence. Outside the windows, the desert sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the rail yard. The heat was finally beginning to break, the temperature dropping toward what Arizonans optimistically called comfortable. Frank returned with a wooden box containing carefully organized tools, screwdrivers with various head types, small pry bars, soft cloths for protecting the wood, and what looked like original Pullman Company maintenance tools from the 1920s. "Your aunt was very specific about how to work on the car," Frank explained, setting the box down. "She insisted on using period-appropriate tools whenever possible. Said it was about respecting the car's integrity." Elena selected a screwdriver that seemed to match the brass screws holding the suspect panel in place. She positioned herself carefully and began to work, mindful of not scratching or damaging the surrounding wood. The first screw came out smoothly, as if it had been removed and replaced many times. Then the second, third, and fourth. The panel was held in place by 8 screws total, and once Elena removed them all, the panel came free easily, revealing a hollow space behind it. Inside was a metal document box, similar to what you might use for fireproof document storage. It was perhaps 18 inches wide, 12 inches tall, and 6 inches deep, carefully sized to fit in the hollow space between the train car's outer wall and inner paneling. Elena lifted it out carefully. The box was heavier than she expected. She set it on the fold-down table and tried the latch. Locked. "There should be a key," Frank said. "Rosa kept it in the journal. She showed me once, said it was important." Elena retrieved the journal from the maid's station. She flipped through the pages until a small brass key fell out, taped to one of the back pages. Her hands trembled as she fitted the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, and the latch clicked open. Inside was the work of 20 years. The burden of truth. The document box was meticulously organized, every item carefully labeled and preserved in archival-quality protective sleeves. Elena began removing items one by one, laying them out on the fold-down table. Photographs, black and white images from the 1920s showing Pullman maids at work, making beds, cleaning compartments, serving passengers. Most of the women in the photos appeared to be Mexican or Mexican-American. They wore identical dark uniforms and maintained professional expressions, but Elena could see the exhaustion in their eyes, the weariness in their posture. One photograph showed her great-grandmother Guadalupe, younger than in the photo Elena had seen before. She stood with a group of other maids beside a train car. On the back, someone had written in faded ink, "Car number 47 crew, Los Angeles Station, August 1929. Letters, a bundle of correspondence, yellow with age but still legible. Elena carefully unfolded one written in Spanish on Pullman Company stationery. "Querida Mama. I cannot come home as planned. They have extended our route again without notice. We will now travel from Los Angeles to El Paso to Mexico City and back. It will be 2 weeks, maybe 3. Please tell Papa and the children I am thinking of them. The work is very hard, Mama. 16 hours each day, sometimes 20 when passengers are difficult. They do not give us proper sleeping quarters. We must rest in the maid's station for a few hours when we can. The pay is less than they promised, and they deduct money for our uniforms, for any mistakes, for being too slow or too fast or not smiling enough. But it is still better than the alternative. At least here I can send money home. Your daughter. Guadalupe. The letter was dated July 1929. More letters followed, from Guadalupe and from other women whose names Elena didn't recognize. All told similar stories: grueling work conditions, wages that were promised but reduced through various deductions, threats of firing or deportation if they complained, harassment from passengers and supervisors alike. Employment records, official Pullman company documents showing names, hire dates, and routes. Elena counted 37 Mexican and Mexican-American women employed on southwestern routes during 1929. Several names, including Guadalupe Torres, were marked with a red stamp, service terminated September 1929. A newspaper clipping from the Los Angeles Times, September 23, 1929, labor unrest on Southern Pacific Line. The article was brief, mentioning minor disturbances among railroad employees that had been resolved by management. No details. No names. But there was more. Much more. Handwritten testimony, pages and pages of accounts written in Spanish and English, each dated and signed. Elena began reading them, and with each page, a story emerged that had been deliberately buried for nearly a century. The testimony described what had happened in September 1929, when a group of Pullman maids on the Los Angeles-El Paso route had attempted to organize for better working conditions. They'd been inspired by the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the black workers' union that had been fighting for improved conditions for years. The Mexican maids had wanted the same: livable wages, reasonable work hours, proper rest facilities, protection from harassment. They'd planned to present a formal petition to management during a scheduled stop in Yuma, Arizona. But someone had informed management of the plan. And management had acted swiftly and brutally. According to the testimony, when the train stopped in Yuma, company security and local police had boarded car number 47. They'd arrested all 37 maids on charges of conspiracy to riot and illegal work stoppage. The women had been taken off the train, detained for 24 hours in a Yuma jail, and then driven to the Mexican border and left there, regardless of whether they were American citizens or not. None of the women were allowed to collect their belongings from the train. None were given their final wages. None were provided transportation home. They were simply abandoned at the border with nothing but the clothes they wore. The Pullman company had then issued a statement saying the women had voluntarily resigned and returned to Mexico. The official records reflected this lie. Elena's vision blurred with tears as she read testimony after testimony. Women describing their terror, their humiliation, their desperate attempts to get home to their families. Several described having children waiting for them, children who would spend weeks not knowing where their mothers were. Guadalupe's testimony was there too, written in her careful handwriting. They took us from the train at night so other passengers would not see. They called us criminals, though we had done nothing wrong except ask to be treated as human beings. They put us in a cell with no water, no food. In the morning, they drove us in trucks to the border and told us never to return or we would be imprisoned. I walked for 3 days to reach my family in Phoenix. I had no money, no food, no water. When I finally arrived home, my children did not recognize me. I had been gone so long, and I looked like a stranger, dirty, sunburned, sick from the walk. I never worked for the railroad again. I never spoke of what happened. I was too afraid. We all were. This is what happens when you ask for dignity. This is what happens when you forget your place. The testimony was dated November 1929, written 2 months after the incident. Elena sat back, overwhelmed. This wasn't just her great-grandmother's story. This was the story of 37 women who had been erased from history, whose courage had been punished, whose voices had been silenced for nearly a century. And her aunt had spent 20 years documenting it all, preserving the evidence, waiting for the right moment to bring their story into the light. The weight of legacy. Elena continued examining the contents of the document box. Behind the letters and testimony were more materials that showed the depth of her aunt's research. Legal documents, copies of Pullman Company policies from the 1920s, highlighting clauses that gave management unlimited power to terminate employees for any reason or no reason. Immigration records showing that several of the women had been born in the United States and were therefore unlawfully deported. Court records showing that no charges had ever been formally filed against any of the 37 women. The arrests had been pretextual, designed to intimidate and remove them. Photographs of the aftermath, images from late 1929 and early 1930 showing the same women working in fields, in factories, doing whatever work they could find after being blacklisted from railroad employment. In every photo, Elena could see the change in their expressions, the pride and professionalism from earlier images replaced by weariness and defeat. Family trees. Her aunt had meticulously traced the descendants of all 37 women. Some families had stayed in the Southwest. Others had scattered across the country. Many had changed their names or had been fractured by the economic devastation that followed the Great Depression. Elena found her own family's entry. Guadalupe Torres had 5 children. Her daughter Isabella, Elena's grandmother, had married and had 2 daughters, including Maria, Elena's mother. The family line continued down to Elena herself. But beside many other names were heartbreaking notes. Family lost contact during Depression years. Descendants unknown, family dispersed. Name change after deportation scare in 1950s. Her aunt had tried to find them all. She'd spent years tracking down descendants, confirming addresses, preserving their stories. A separate document listed names and last known locations for dozens of families. Most striking was a letter her aunt had written but never sent, dated just 1 month before her death. It was addressed to the descendants of the car number 47 maids. I am writing this letter knowing I may not live long enough to see justice for our mothers, grandmothers, and great-grandmothers. My heart has been failing for some time, and the doctors tell me I should settle my affairs. For 20 years, I have worked to preserve the evidence of what happened to 37 brave women in September 1929. Women who asked for dignity and received deportation. Women who fought for their rights and were erased from history. I have restored this train car, the very car where they worked, where they planned their action, where they were arrested, as a memorial to their courage. Inside these walls is preserved everything I could find, their letters, their testimony, photographs, documents that prove what was done to them. My hope is that someone will inherit this car who has the courage to finish what I started. Someone who will bring these stories into the light. Someone who will demand acknowledgement of what was done and seek justice, even if that justice comes nearly a century late. These women deserve to be remembered. Their families deserve to know their stories. The Pullman Company and the railroad companies that benefited from their labor deserve to be held accountable for their cruelty. To whoever finds this, do not let their stories die in these walls. Make the world remember. Elena wiped tears from her eyes. The sun outside had nearly set, casting the interior of the train car in golden light that filtered through the windows. She sat surrounded by decades of silence, holding evidence of an injustice that powerful interests had worked hard to bury. Frank stood quietly near the door, giving her space to process what she'd discovered. Finally, he spoke. Your aunt spent the last 2 years trying to get historical societies and museums interested in this story. She contacted reporters, academics, labor historians. Most never responded. A few expressed polite interest but never followed through. Why not? Elena asked, her voice thick with emotion. Some said the evidence was too anecdotal. Others said it was too politically sensitive given current immigration debates. A few said outright that they didn't want to damage the reputation of the Pullman Company or the railroad industry. Frank's voice was bitter. Rosa got tired of being dismissed. She decided the best thing she could do was preserve everything and wait for the right person to find it. Elena looked down at her great-grandmother's testimony, at the careful handwriting describing suffering and injustice. She thought about her grandmother's tears when she'd looked at Guadalupe's photograph. She thought about her mother's anger whenever Aunt Rosa was mentioned, an anger that now seemed less like resentment and more like fear of what might be revealed. How many family secrets, Elena wondered, were really just historical truths that people were too afraid to confront? The decision point. What are you going to do? Frank asked gently. Elena looked around the train car, this beautiful, painstakingly restored memorial that her aunt had created. She thought about the $800 monthly rental fee she couldn't afford. The student loans. The credit card debt. The practical impossibility of maintaining this. She also thought about 37 women whose courage had been punished, whose stories had been deliberately erased. She thought about the descendants who didn't know their family's history. She thought about her aunt's 20 years of work, all leading to this moment. I don't know, she admitted. I'm a broke law student with more debt than assets. I can't afford to keep this car. I can barely afford rent. You could sell it, Frank suggested, though his tone made it clear he hoped she wouldn't. Fully restored Pullman cars like this can fetch $200,000, maybe more from the right collector. $200,000 would solve every financial problem Elena had. She could pay off her student loans, clear her credit card debt, finish law school without working, maybe even help her mother. It would be the practical, sensible choice. But looking at her great-grandmother's photograph, at the testimony written in her careful hand, Elena knew she couldn't simply sell this to the highest bidder. This wasn't just a train car. It was a memorial. It was evidence. It was a responsibility. The rental is paid through the end of next month? Elena confirmed. Frank nodded. July 31st. After that, you'd need to either pay for August or make other arrangements. So I have about 5 weeks to figure out what to do. That's right. Elena began carefully returning items to the document box. Each letter, each photograph, each piece of testimony went back into its protective sleeve. When everything was secured, she locked the box and turned to Frank. I need to think about this. I need to research what my options are, legally, historically, practically. Can I leave the box here for now? Of course. The car is yours. Everything in it is yours. I'll keep it secure. Elena replaced the mahogany panel, carefully screwing it back into place with the period-appropriate tools. When she was finished, the modification was once again invisible. Just as her aunt had intended, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone ready to see. As they walked back toward the office through the deepening twilight, Frank offered one more piece of information. Your aunt left something else for you. She gave it to me about 3 months ago, said to give it to whoever inherited the car. It's in my office safe. Back in the air-conditioned office, Frank retrieved a manila envelope from a small safe behind his desk. He handed it to Elena. Her name was written on the front in her aunt's handwriting. Inside was a letter and a small key. Elena unfolded the letter and read. Querida Elena. If you're reading this, then I have passed, and you have found what I spent 20 years preserving. I hope you understand now why I made the choices I did, why I gave up family gatherings and social connections, why I poured every resource into this train car. I was angry for so long. Angry that Guadalupe's story, all of their stories, had been buried. Angry that my mother took those stories to her grave without justice. Angry that the world moved on while pretending these women never existed. But anger alone doesn't change anything. Documentation does. Evidence does. And now you have both. The key enclosed is for a safety deposit box at Arizona First National Bank in Phoenix, Box 247. Inside is $50,000, all the money I have left. I know you're struggling financially. I know you have student loans and debt. This money could make your life easier. But I'm asking you to consider using it for something else, to bring these stories into the light. To find the descendants. To demand acknowledgement of what was done. To finish what I started. I cannot tell you what to do, Sabrina. The money is yours regardless. But I believe you inherited more than just a train car and some cash. You inherited a responsibility to the past and an opportunity to shape the future. Your great-grandmother Guadalupe was a brave woman who asked for dignity and was punished for it. Don't let her bravery be forgotten. Don't let their courage be for nothing. I chose you because you're studying law, because you understand justice, and because you have the stubbornness of the Torres women running through your veins. You can do what I was too old and too tired to finish. The truth is in the walls, Mija. And now that truth is in your hands. Make them remember. With love. Tia Rosa. Elena stood in Frank's office, holding the letter and key, overwhelmed by the weight of what she'd inherited. Not just a train car. Not just money. But a mission. A cause. A chance to right a historical wrong that had echoed through generations. Outside, night had fully fallen over the desert. The rail yard was dark except for a few security lights casting pools of illumination across the rusted equipment. In that darkness, Pullman car number 47 sat gleaming and waiting, holding its secrets and its stories, preserved by one woman's determination and now entrusted to another. Elena thought about her exam in 3 days. Her paralegal job that paid her bills. Her studio apartment and her ramen noodles and her careful budgeting. Her plan to graduate, pass the bar, get a stable job at a law firm, and slowly climb out of debt. All of that represented safety. Predictability. The sensible path. But standing in this rail yard, holding evidence of an injustice that had been deliberately forgotten, Elena felt something shift inside her. Maybe some things were more important than safety. Maybe some stories needed to be told regardless of the personal cost. She looked at Frank. I'm going to need your help. And I'm going to need time. Can you give me until the end of July to figure this out? Frank smiled, a real smile, warm and approving. Your aunt would be proud. Yes, the rental is covered through July. And whatever you need from me, access to the car, help with research, connections to railroad historians, you've got it. Elena shook his hand, feeling the calluses of a man who'd worked with his hands his entire life. Then she walked back to her car, carrying the manila envelope in her aunt's journal, her mind already racing with possibilities and plans. As she drove back toward Phoenix, the lights of the city gradually appearing on the horizon, Elena thought about the woman in the photograph, her great-grandmother Guadalupe, standing proud in her uniform beside a train car. A woman who'd had the courage to ask for dignity even when it cost her everything. That courage was part of Elena's inheritance too. It ran in her blood, passed down through generations of Torres women who'd survived and persisted despite everything the world threw at them. By the time Elena reached her studio apartment in Tempe, exhausted and emotionally drained, she'd made a decision. She wasn't going to sell the train car. She wasn't going to take the easy path. She was going to honor her aunt's 20 years of work and her great-grandmother's courage. She was going to make the world remember. The path forward. Elena's apartment was small, a studio barely 400 square feet, with a kitchenette that was more of a suggestion than an actual kitchen, and a bathroom so tiny you had to choose between standing at the sink or opening the door, but not both. But it was hers, and tonight it felt like a war room as she spread her aunt's journal and the manila envelope across her second-hand coffee table. It was nearly midnight. She had to be at work in 9 hours, and she still hadn't studied for her constitutional law exam. But none of that seemed to matter as much as the question burning in her mind: how do you bring a forgotten story back to life? Elena made coffee, cheap instant coffee that tasted like bitter regret but contained enough caffeine to keep her functioning. She opened her laptop and began researching, following the threads her aunt had started. The Pullman Company had been one of the largest employers of black workers in the early 20th century, and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters had eventually won significant victories for those workers. That story was well documented, celebrated even, as an important chapter in both labor history and civil rights history. But the story of the Mexican and Mexican-American workers, particularly the women, was virtually absent from the historical record. A few academic papers mentioned their existence in passing, but Elena found no comprehensive accounts, no museums dedicated to their stories, no monuments or memorials. It was as if they'd been erased twice, once in 1929 when they were arrested and deported, and again by historians who'd simply overlooked them when writing about the Pullman Company and railroad labor. Elena found one particularly relevant detail in her research. In 2019, the U.S. House of Representatives had passed a resolution officially apologizing for the forced repatriation of Mexican Americans during the Great Depression. Between 1929 and 1936, approximately 1 to 2 million people of Mexican descent, many of them U.S. citizens, had been deported or coerced into leaving the country. The car number 47 incident had occurred at the very beginning of that dark period. The 37 maids had been among the first victims of a campaign of intimidation and deportation that would soon expand to affect millions. That gave Elena an idea. A legal idea. She spent the next 2 hours researching reparations cases, historical justice initiatives, and legal frameworks for addressing past wrongs. She found examples from around the world: the U.S. government's apology and reparations to Japanese Americans interned during World War II. Germany's reparations to Holocaust survivors. Canada's compensation to Indigenous peoples for residential schools. None of the examples were perfect analogies, but they provided frameworks. They showed that it was possible, difficult, but possible, to achieve some measure of justice for historical wrongs, even decades after the fact. By 2 a.m., Elena had filled 5 pages of her legal pad with notes and ideas. Her plan was taking shape. Phase 1, document and verify everything. Take her aunt's research and build it into an airtight historical record that could withstand scrutiny. Get historians, archivists, and legal experts to review and authenticate the evidence. Phase 2, find the descendants. Her aunt had already done much of this work, but Elena would need to update it, make contact, and get their consent to share their family stories. Phase 3, go public. Contact media outlets, historical societies, museums. Create a campaign to ensure these stories were heard and remembered. Phase 4, seek formal acknowledgement and compensation. This was the most ambitious part, convincing modern railroad companies, the successors to Southern Pacific and the Pullman Company, to acknowledge what happened and provide some form of reparations to descendants. It was an audacious plan. Probably impossible. Certainly well beyond the capabilities of a broke law student with no connections and limited experience. But as Elena finally closed her laptop and fell into bed at 3 a.m., she felt something she hadn't felt in years: purpose. Not just the grind of survival, but actual meaning. Her great-grandmother had asked for dignity and been denied. Her aunt had worked for 20 years to preserve the truth. Now it was Elena's turn to finish what they'd started. Tomorrow she would go to work, take her exam, and try to maintain some semblance of her normal life. But everything had changed. She had inherited more than a train car. She had inherited a mission. And the Torres women, as her aunt had said, were nothing if not stubborn. Elena's alarm pierced through her exhausted sleep at 6:30 a.m., after only 3.5 hours of rest. Her body felt like lead, her mind foggy from the emotional overload of the previous day combined with severe sleep deprivation. For a moment, she lay in bed staring at the water-stained ceiling of her studio apartment, wondering if yesterday had been some kind of fever dream. Then she turned her head and saw her aunt's journal sitting on the coffee table, the manila envelope beside it, and knew with certainty that it had all been real. She had inherited a train car. She had discovered evidence of a historical injustice. She had committed herself to a mission that might be completely beyond her capabilities. And she had a constitutional law exam in 2 days that she hadn't studied for. Elena dragged herself out of bed and into the shower, letting the lukewarm water, her building's hot water heater was perpetually inadequate, wash away some of her exhaustion. As she stood under the weak stream, her mind replayed scenes from yesterday: the gleaming burgundy train car, her great-grandmother's photograph, the testimony written in careful handwriting, her aunt's letter asking her to finish what had been started. By the time she dried off and dressed in her work clothes, a thrift store blazer and slacks that were professional enough for the law firm but showed their age and wear, Elena had made several decisions about her immediate next steps. First, she needed to verify everything. Her paralegal training had taught her that documentation was everything. Before she could go public with this story, she needed to ensure every piece of evidence was authentic, every claim was verifiable, and every detail was airtight. Second, she needed to retrieve that $50,000 from the safety deposit box. Not because she decided how to use it yet, but because leaving that much money sitting in a bank without even confirming it existed seemed foolish. Third, she needed to talk to someone who understood both legal strategy and historical research. Someone she could trust. As Elena grabbed her messenger bag and headed out the door, she was already mentally composing a list of people who might be able to help her. The list was depressingly short. The law firm Henderson and Associates occupied the third floor of a mid-rise office building in downtown Phoenix. The firm specialized in corporate law, contract disputes, and exactly the kind of boring but profitable legal work that kept the lights on but rarely made headlines. Elena had worked there as a paralegal for 18 months, and while the pay was barely above minimum wage and the work was mind-numbing, it was stable employment that looked good on her law school applications. She arrived at 8:15 a.m., 15 minutes late due to a traffic accident on the I-10, and immediately dove into the pile of document review that had been waiting for her since last week. Her supervising attorney, Marcus Henderson, the founder's grandson and a man who'd failed upward through family connections rather than actual legal talent, had left a sticky note on her desk: "Need these contracts reviewed by noon. Don't miss deadline again." Elena had missed exactly one deadline in 18 months, due to her mother's hospitalization, but Marcus had held it over her head ever since. She settled into the mind-numbing work of reviewing commercial lease agreements, her eyes scanning page after page of dense legal language while her mind wandered to the much more interesting legal questions surrounding her inheritance. Could descendants of the deported maids file claims against successor companies? What statute of limitations applied to civil rights violations from 1929? Were there precedents for reparations in similar cases? Torres. Marcus's voice cut through her concentration. "My office. Now." Elena saved her work and made her way to Marcus's corner office, which was decorated with his law school diploma, bottom third of his class from a fourth-tier school, framed photos of him playing golf with various local politicians, and a massive desk that seemed designed to intimidate anyone sitting across from it. "You were late this morning," Marcus said without preamble. "Traffic accident on the I-10. I don't care about excuses. You're a paralegal, Torres. Replaceable. There are a dozen law students who'd kill for your job." Elena bit back the response that came to mind, that those law students probably had family money and didn't need to work full-time while attending night school, that Marcus himself had never worked a day without his family's safety net, that she'd single-handedly saved this firm from a malpractice claim last year when she'd caught Marcus's mistake on a filing deadline. Instead, she said simply, "It won't happen again. See that it doesn't. The contracts need to be done by noon. No excuses." As Elena returned to her desk, her phone buzzed with a text from her mother: "Did you deal with Rose's junk yet? Don't waste time on it." Elena stared at the message, thinking about how her mother's dismissal of Rose's junk was really a dismissal of family history, of her own grandmother's suffering, of stories that deserved to be told. The Torres women had spent decades trying to forget what had happened in 1929. Maybe it was time to remember instead. She texted back, "Working on it. We'll call you later." Elena powered through the contract reviews, finishing at 11:47 a.m., 13 minutes before Marcus's arbitrary deadline. As soon as she submitted the completed work, she grabbed her bag and headed out for lunch, claiming she had a doctor's appointment. She didn't. She had a bank appointment. Arizona First National Bank was a 15-minute walk from the law firm, housed in a glass and steel building that spoke of financial stability and corporate success. Elena had never had reason to visit before. Her own banking was done at a credit union that charged fewer fees, but according to her aunt's letter, this was where the safety deposit box waited. The bank's interior was aggressively air-conditioned, a stark contrast to the 109-degree heat outside. Elena approached the customer service desk, where a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled silver hair and a nameplate reading Vivian Martinez greeted her with professional warmth. "How can I help you today?" Elena pulled out the small key in her aunt's letter. "I need to access a safety deposit box. Box 247. It belonged to my aunt, Elena Torres, who recently passed away. Vivian's expression softened. I'm sorry for your loss. Do you have documentation showing you're authorized to access the box? Elena produced her aunt's letter along with the death certificate she'd received from the attorney, Margaret Chen. Vivian reviewed everything carefully, then asked Elena to wait while she verified the authorization. 20 minutes later, Elena was being led into the vault room, a secure area lined with numbered boxes of various sizes. Vivian used a bank key in combination with Elena's inherited key to open box 247, a medium-sized compartment. She pulled out a metal box, similar in size to the document box from the train car, and handed it to Elena. You can use one of our privacy rooms, Vivian said, gesturing to a row of small booths. Take all the time you need. Elena settled into one of the booths and opened the box with trembling hands. Inside, as promised, were stacks of $100 bills, neatly bundled and labeled. Elena counted quickly, $50,000 exactly. More money than she'd ever seen in one place. More than enough to pay off a significant chunk of her student loans, to give her mother some financial security, to make her own life dramatically easier. But there was more in the box. Beneath the money was another envelope, and inside that envelope was a USB drive labeled Digital Archive, full documentation, and a letter. Elena unfolded the letter. Elena. If you've come this far, you've seen what's in the train car. Now you need to see everything else. The USB drive contains 20 years of research. Everything I found, everyone I interviewed, every document I photographed, every piece of evidence I gathered. It's organized by category: employment records, testimony, photographs, legal documents, descendant research, and modern context. I also included a section called The Opposition. You need to understand who fought to keep this story buried and why. It's not just ancient history. There are people today who have vested interests in keeping this quiet. The Pullman Company no longer exists, but its successor companies do. Southern Pacific was absorbed by Union Pacific Railroad in 1996. Union Pacific is now one of the largest railroad companies in North America, worth billions. They don't want stories about labor abuses and illegal deportations associated with their brand. More importantly, there are families in Arizona, wealthy families, whose fortunes were built partially on taking over businesses and properties that belonged to deported workers. When people were forcibly removed and couldn't return, their shops, their land, their possessions were often seized by opportunistic buyers who paid pennies on the dollar or simply took what wasn't legally defended. I identified 12 such families in the Phoenix area alone. Some are still prominent today. Some have descendants serving in state government, sitting on corporate boards, controlling local media outlets. I tried to go public with this story 5 years ago. Within a week, I lost my job, my insurance was mysteriously canceled, and someone broke into my apartment, though nothing was stolen, just a clear message that I was being watched. That's when I decided to preserve everything in the train car and wait for the right person to carry this forward. You're young, Elena. You're studying law. You understand how systems work and how to fight them. You can do this better than I could. But please be careful. The money in this box is yours to use however you see fit. If you decide this fight is too dangerous, too difficult, or too costly, personally or professionally, then take the money, sell the train car, and walk away. I won't judge you from beyond the grave. But if you choose to fight, use this money strategically. Hire a good attorney. Pay for archival work. Cover your expenses so you're not doing this while drowning in debt. Make sure you have resources to see it through. And remember, you're not alone. There are 36 other families out there, descendants of the other maids. Find them. Unite them. Together, you'll be stronger than any corporation or powerful family. I love you, Sabrina. I always did, even during the years we didn't speak. I'm sorry I chose this mission over family gatherings, but I hope you'll understand that I was fighting for family in a different way. Fighting for Guadalupe, for your grandmother, for all the Torres women who came before. Now I'm passing the fight to you. Con amor y esperanza. Tia Rosa. Elena sat in the privacy booth, tears streaming down her face as she read her aunt's words. The letter made everything feel more real and more dangerous. Her aunt had faced consequences for trying to tell this story. What made Elena think she could do better? She carefully returned the letter to the envelope, pocketed the USB drive, and after a long moment of internal debate, withdrew $5,000 from the cash, enough to cover immediate expenses and buy her some breathing room. The rest she left in the box. As she exited the bank into the Phoenix heat, Elena felt the weight of the USB drive in her pocket like a small explosive device. 20 years of research. Evidence of opposition. Names of families who'd profited from deportation. This was bigger than she'd imagined. And more dangerous. The research begins. Elena couldn't return to work, not yet, not with her mind spinning with questions and possibilities. She texted Marcus claiming her doctor's appointment was running long, then walked to a nearby coffee shop with reliable Wi-Fi. She ordered a large coffee and a sandwich, the first real meal she'd eaten in 24 hours, and settled into a corner booth with her laptop. She inserted the USB drive and opened its contents. Her aunt hadn't been exaggerating. The archive was enormous, meticulously organized into folders and subfolders, each containing scanned documents, transcribed interviews, photographs, and detailed notes. Elena started with the folder labeled Opposition, Context and Actors. Inside were documents that painted a disturbing picture of coordinated efforts to suppress the car number 47 story. Her aunt had documented 5 specific instances between 2015 and 2020 when she'd attempted to bring the story to public attention. Attempt number 1: Arizona Historical Society. 2015 Rosa had approached the society with her research, proposing an exhibit about Mexican railroad workers. The initial response had been positive, with a curator expressing enthusiasm. But 2 weeks later, Rosa received a form letter saying the society had decided to pursue other programming directions. Her aunt's notes indicated she later learned that a major donor, the Whitmore Foundation, had objected to the exhibit as potentially divisive. Attempt number 2: University of Arizona History Department. 2016 A professor specializing in labor history had initially been very interested in Rosa's research and had even written a preliminary article for an academic journal. Before publication, the professor received pressure from the university's administration, which was in the middle of a capital campaign that included major donors from railroad industry families. The article was quietly killed. The professor, whom Rosa declined to name to protect their career, apologized but said they couldn't risk their tenure. Attempt number 3: Phoenix New Times. 2017 An investigative reporter had spent 3 months working with Rosa on an extensive article about the deportations. The piece was scheduled to run, and Rosa had even done a photo shoot at the train car. Days before publication, the article was pulled. The reporter told Rosa that ownership, the New Times had recently been purchased by a media conglomerate, had concerns about legal liability and unverified claims, despite the extensive documentation Rosa had provided. Attempt number 4: Latino Rights Coalition. 2018 A local advocacy organization had seemed like a natural ally. They'd held several meetings with Rosa, expressed strong support, and even helped her organize some preliminary outreach to descendants. Then, suddenly, and without clear explanation, the organization cut off contact. Rosa's notes suggested that someone had convinced the organization's leadership that pursuing this story would jeopardize their relationship with corporate donors and political allies. Attempt number 5: Direct contact with Union Pacific Railroad. 2019 As a last resort, Rosa had reached out directly to Union Pacific's corporate headquarters, sending a detailed letter outlining the history and requesting that the company acknowledge what had happened and consider reparations for descendants. She received a form letter from the legal department stating that the company could not comment on events allegedly occurring nearly a century ago under different corporate ownership and management. When Rosa persisted, she received a letter from the company's attorneys threatening legal action if she continued to make defamatory claims about the railroad. Shortly after that final attempt, the consequences her aunt had described in her letter had followed: job loss, canceled insurance, the break-in. Elena felt a chill reading through these accounts. Her aunt hadn't been paranoid. She'd faced real, coordinated opposition from powerful entities that had strong motivations to keep this story buried. The folder also contained profiles of 12 Arizona families that Rosa had identified as having profited directly from the 1929 to 1936 deportation period. These families had acquired businesses, real estate, and other assets from Mexican Americans who'd been forced to leave and couldn't defend their property claims. Several names stood out. The Whitmore family, now one of Arizona's wealthiest families, with holdings in real estate development, banking, and media. The family patriarch in the 1930s, Charles Whitmore, had acquired several properties in Phoenix's downtown area for remarkably low prices during the deportation period. The family now controlled the Whitmore Foundation, which was a major donor to cultural institutions, universities, and political campaigns throughout Arizona. The Blackwood family, the senior partner of Blackwood & Chen, the law firm that had sent Elena the inheritance notice, descended from the Blackwood family that had represented property buyers during the deportation period. The family had specialized in facilitating sales of properties from desperate families who were being deported or feared deportation. The Preston family, owners of Preston Industries, a major construction and development company. The family's fortune began with acquiring farmland from deported Mexican-American families in the 1930s. That land, now within Phoenix city limits, was worth tens of millions of dollars. The list continued, each family representing wealth built at least partially on the suffering of deported workers and their families. Rosa had also documented connections between these families and current political and business leaders. Board memberships, campaign donations, charitable foundations, all creating a web of influence that touched every major institution in Arizona. No wonder her aunt had faced such coordinated opposition. She hadn't just been challenging historical narrative, she'd been threatening the reputational foundations of some of Arizona's most powerful families. The phone call. Elena was so absorbed in the research that she didn't notice the time until her phone rang, startling her. It was her mother. "Elena? Where are you? I stopped by your apartment and you weren't there." "I'm at a coffee shop, Mama. Doing some research." "Why did you come by?" "We need to talk about Rosa's estate. I've been thinking about what you should do with that train car." Elena felt her jaw tighten. "What about it?" "You should sell it immediately. I called a salvage dealer this morning. I still have connections from when your father worked in scrap metal. They said a restored train car like that could fetch $50,000, maybe more. You could use that money, Mija. Pay off some of your debt." "How do you know it's restored?" Elena asked carefully. "You said you never went to see it." There was a pause on the other end. Rosa talked about it. Before we stopped speaking. She was always going on about her train car project. "The train car that you called junk this morning?" "Elena, don't be difficult. I'm trying to help you. You don't need to waste your time on Rosa's obsession. Sell it, take the money, focus on finishing law school." Elena took a deep breath. "Mama, did Abuela ever tell you what happened to her mother?" "To Guadalupe?" The silence on the other end stretched so long that Elena thought the call might have dropped. Finally, her mother spoke, her voice tight. "Your grandmother told me some things. Old stories. Things that happened during the Depression. About the railroad? About what they did to the maids." "Elena." Her mother's voice was sharp now, almost panicked. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. You're getting caught up in Rosa's conspiracy theories. She spent 20 years chasing ghosts, alienating everyone who cared about her. Don't make the same mistake. They're not conspiracy theories, Mama. I found the evidence. Letters, testimony, photographs. It all happened. 37 women were arrested and deported for trying to organize for better working conditions. Guadalupe was one of them." "I know." The words came out as barely more than a whisper. Elena froze. "You knew?" "My mother told me before she died. Made me promise to let it stay buried. She said nothing good would come from digging it up. She said that's what destroyed Rosa's life, refusing to let the past stay in the past. So you knew, and you just, what? Decided to pretend it never happened? I decided to protect my daughter. Maria's voice rose, emotional now. Do you think I want you fighting powerful people over something that happened 95 years ago? Do you think I want you to end up like Rosa, alone, obsessed, throwing your life away for dead people who can't be helped? They can be helped. Their descendants can be helped. Justice can. Justice? Maria laughed, a bitter sound. Mija, there is no justice. Not for people like us. There's just survival. You get your education, you get a good job, you keep your head down, and you take care of your family. That's all that matters. Is that what Guadalupe would have wanted? For her story to be forgotten? For her courage to be dismissed? She would have wanted her family to be safe. Maria was crying now. She would have wanted us to have better lives than she did. And we do. Because we move forward instead of looking back. Elena felt tears on her own cheeks. I can't just forget about this, Mama. Then you're making a mistake. A big one. And don't come crying to me when you lose everything chasing Rosa's ghosts. The line went dead. Elena sat in the coffee shop, staring at her phone, feeling the gulf between her and her mother widen into something that might never be bridged. Her mother had chosen forgetting. Rosa had chosen remembering. And now Elena had to choose too. The expert consultation. Elena couldn't do this alone, that much was clear. She needed expert help, someone who understood both the historical context and the legal complexities. Someone who wouldn't be intimidated by powerful families or corporations. She thought through her very short list of contacts and kept coming back to one name, Dr. Carmen Reyes. Dr. Reyes was a professor at Arizona State University specializing in Mexican-American history and labor studies. Elena had taken her course on civil rights and social justice movements during her undergraduate years and had been fascinated by Dr. Reyes's approach, rigorous scholarship combined with passionate advocacy for historical truth. After the class ended, Elena had occasionally attended Dr. Reyes's public lectures and had even volunteered for one of her oral history projects, interviewing elderly Mexican-American workers about their experiences during the Bracero program. They hadn't stayed in close contact, but Elena had always respected her and thought she might be sympathetic to this cause. It was worth a try. Elena composed an email, trying to sound professional rather than desperate. Dear Dr. Reyes. I don't know if you remember me. I was a student in your Civil Rights and Social Justice Movements course in 2019 and volunteered on your Bracero program oral history project. I'm now a third-year law student at ASU, night program, and working as a paralegal while I finish my degree. I'm writing because I've recently inherited some materials related to a largely forgotten incident from 1929 involving Mexican-American railroad workers, specifically, Pullman maids who were arrested and deported for attempting to organize for better working conditions. I believe this story deserves to be brought into public awareness, but I'm in over my head and need guidance from someone with expertise in this area of history. Would you be willing to meet with me to discuss this? I have extensive documentation and evidence, and I think you'll find the story both historically significant and deeply troubling. I understand you're busy, but I hope you'll consider this. The story involves my own great-grandmother, so it's both personal and historical for me. Respectfully, Elena Torres. Elena hit send before she could second-guess the wording, then spent the next hour continuing to review the materials on the USB drive, taking detailed notes and beginning to organize her thoughts about how to approach this project. Her phone buzzed with an email notification. Dr. Reyes had already responded. Elena. Of course I remember you. You were one of my most engaged students and did excellent work on the oral history interviews. Your email has my full attention. The incident you're describing sounds like it might be connected to the broader patterns of deportation and repatriation during that period, but I'm not familiar with this specific case involving Pullman workers. If you have documentation, I'd be very interested to see it. I have office hours tomorrow, Thursday, from 2 to 4 p.m., or we could meet at a coffee shop if you prefer somewhere off campus. I have to warn you that if this story is what you think it is, bringing it to light will not be easy. I've spent my career studying these suppressed histories, and I've learned that there are always powerful interests invested in keeping them buried. But if the story needs to be told, then it needs to be told. Let me know when works for you. Carmen Reyes. Elena felt a surge of relief and hope. At least one person was willing to listen. She immediately replied suggesting they meet the next day at 2 p.m., and Dr. Reyes confirmed. It was a start. The confrontation at work. Elena returned to the law firm at 3:30 p.m., hoping Marcus would be in a client meeting and she could slip back to her desk unnoticed. No such luck. Torres. My office. Now. This was becoming a pattern Elena didn't appreciate. Marcus was standing behind his desk, his face red with anger. You were gone for 3 hours. 3 hours for a doctor's appointment. Do you think I'm stupid? I had personal business to attend to. Personal business on company time. I checked with HR. You didn't request personal leave. You didn't follow protocol. You just disappeared. Elena took a breath, trying to remain professional. I apologize. It was an emergency related to my aunt's estate. It won't happen again. You're right about that. It won't happen again because you're fired. Elena felt the words like a physical blow. What? You're unreliable, Torres. Late this morning, gone for hours this afternoon, and frankly, your attitude has been problematic for a while. We need paralegals who are committed to the firm, not people treating this like a part-time gig while they play lawyer in night school. I've never missed a deadline. I've never made a mistake on any filing. This isn't a debate. Clear out your desk. HR will process your final paycheck. You're done. Elena stood there, stunned. She needed this job. It paid her rent. It looked good on her law school applications. Losing it would make everything harder. But looking at Marcus's smug expression, she realized something. She wasn't going to beg. She wasn't going to grovel to this mediocre lawyer who'd never worked for anything in his life. Fine, she said calmly. I'll clear out my desk. As she packed her few personal belongings into her messenger bag, a coffee mug, some legal pads, a framed photo of her grandmother, her coworker Sandra approached. I'm sorry, Elena, Sandra whispered. This is bullshit. You're the best paralegal we have. It's fine, Elena said, though it really wasn't. Sandra glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then leaned in closer. Between you and me? I think someone called Marcus this morning. I overheard part of his conversation. Something about you asking questions about the Pullman company and railroad history. Someone wanted to make sure you were discouraged from pursuing whatever you were pursuing. Elena's blood ran cold. Who called? I don't know. But it scared Marcus. I've never seen him that deferential to someone on the phone. Whoever it was has serious influence. So it was starting already. The opposition her aunt had warned about. Someone had learned Elena was asking questions, and they'd moved quickly to apply pressure. Elena finished packing and walked out of Henderson and Associates for the last time, her messenger bag over her shoulder, unemployed and facing an increasingly uncertain future. But as she stepped out into the late afternoon Phoenix heat, she felt something unexpected, relief. She was free. Free from Marcus's condescension. Free from mind-numbing contract reviews. Free to focus entirely on the mission she'd inherited. She still had $5,000 in cash from her aunt's safety deposit box. She still had her meeting with Dr. Reyes tomorrow. She still had a train car full of evidence and a story that deserved to be told. Getting fired might have been the best thing that could have happened. As Elena walked to her car, her phone buzzed with another email. This one was from an address she didn't recognize, anonymous_sender_477@protonmail.com. The subject line read, regarding your recent inquiries. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Ms. Torres, we are aware of your recent inheritance and the materials you have acquired. We want you to know that pursuing this matter publicly would be unwise for several reasons. 1. The historical claims are unverifiable and would be challenged by expert historians. 2. The modern legal implications are non-existent given the passage of time. 3. Making accusations against prominent families and companies would expose you to significant legal liability. We strongly encourage you to reconsider any plans to publicize these materials. There are people willing to purchase the train car and all associated materials for a fair price, significantly more than market value. This would allow you to move forward with your life and your legal career without unnecessary complications. Consider this a friendly warning. Not all future communications will be as cordial. We will be in touch. Elena read the message 3 times, her heart pounding. They didn't even bother to disguise it as anything other than a threat. Someone was watching her. Someone knew about the train car, about her research, about her plans. And they wanted her to stop before she even started. Elena tried to forward the email to herself as backup, but when she attempted to do so, an error message appeared. She checked her sent folder, nothing. She went back to her inbox to read it again. The email was gone. She refreshed the page. Checked her trash folder. Searched her entire email account. Nothing. The message had completely disappeared as if it had never existed. Elena felt a chill run down her spine despite the Arizona heat. These people, whoever they were, had resources and technical capabilities beyond what she'd anticipated. They could make emails appear and disappear. They could get her fired with a single phone call. They were monitoring her movements, her communications, her activities. For the first time since inheriting the train car, Elena felt genuinely afraid. Not just worried or anxious, but scared for her safety. She sat in her car in the parking garage, hands shaking on the steering wheel, trying to decide what to do next. She could walk away. Take her mother's advice. Sell the train car, forget about the story, focus on survival. Find a new paralegal job, finish law school, live a normal, safe life. Or she could do what her great-grandmother had done in 1929, ask for dignity even when it was dangerous. Stand up even when powerful forces wanted her silent. Fight for justice even when the cost might be everything. Elena thought about Guadalupe's testimony, written in careful handwriting. This is what happens when you ask for dignity. This is what happens when you forget your place. Her great-grandmother had been punished for refusing to stay silent. Now, nearly a century later, powerful interests were trying to silence Elena the same way, through intimidation, through economic pressure, through fear. But the Torres women, as her aunt had said, were stubborn. Elena started her car and drove toward Tempe, her jaw set with determination. They'd fired her. They'd threatened her. They'd tried to make evidence disappear and make her disappear with it. But she wasn't disappearing. She wasn't staying silent. She wasn't forgetting her place. Tomorrow she would meet with Dr. Reyes. She would start building a team of allies who couldn't be intimidated. She would prepare to fight back against whoever was trying to keep this story buried. The truth was in the walls. And Elena was going to make sure the world heard it, no matter who tried to stop her. As she drove through Phoenix traffic, Elena made one more decision. She pulled over, took out her phone, and began documenting everything that had happened today. The firing. The anonymous email. The threat. She wrote it all down in a note app, then emailed it to herself at 3 different email addresses, saved it to cloud storage, and texted a copy to a friend from law school who she trusted. If they wanted to make her disappear, she'd make sure her story couldn't disappear with her. The sun was setting over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, as Elena pulled into her apartment complex. She was unemployed, threatened, and facing an enemy she couldn't fully identify. Her mother had disowned her mission. Her financial situation was more precarious than ever. But she had evidence. She had allies beginning to form. She had her aunt's 20 years of research. And she had the courage of women who'd come before her, women who'd asked for dignity when it cost them everything. Tomorrow would be the real beginning. Tomorrow she'd start building the case. Tomorrow she'd begin the fight. Tonight, she'd rest and prepare for war. The next morning, Elena woke with a sense of purpose she'd never felt before. Despite everything, the job loss, the threats, her mother's rejection, she felt oddly liberated. She no longer had to balance her mission with the demands of a soul-crushing job. She could focus entirely on bringing the car number 47 story into the light. Her meeting with Dr. Carmen Reyes was scheduled for 2 p.m. Elena spent the morning organizing her aunt's research materials, preparing a presentation that would convince the professor this story was worth fighting for. She arrived at Dr. Reyes's office 15 minutes early, carrying her laptop and a printed summary of the key evidence. The professor's office was exactly what Elena expected, walls lined with books about labor history and civil rights, photographs of various protests and marches, and a desk covered with student papers and research materials. Dr. Reyes greeted her warmly, her dark eyes sharp with intelligence behind stylish glasses. She was in her late 50s, with silver-streaked black hair pulled into a neat bun, and she radiated the confidence of someone who'd spent decades fighting for historical truth. "Elena, come in. I've been thinking about your email all night. Tell me everything." For the next hour, Elena laid out the entire story. She showed Dr. Reyes the photographs of her great-grandmother and the other maids. She shared the testimony describing the arrests and deportations. She explained her aunt's 20 years of research and the coordinated opposition Rosa had faced. She described her own job loss and the anonymous threats. Dr. Reyes listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, taking notes, examining documents with the practiced eye of a historian who knew how to evaluate evidence. When Elena finished, Dr. Reyes sat back in her chair, her expression a mixture of anger and vindication. "This is exactly what I've suspected for years," she said quietly. "I've been studying the Mexican repatriation period since I started my PhD 30 years ago. The official numbers say 1 to 2 million people of Mexican descent were deported or coerced into leaving between 1929 and 1936. But the individual stories, the specific incidents, the names, the details, those have been systematically erased from the historical record." She gestured to Elena's materials. "This documentation is extraordinary. Your aunt did the work of 10 historians. If we can verify and authenticate everything, and from what I've seen, it all appears legitimate, this could be one of the most significant historical discoveries related to that period. Will you help me?" Elena asked. "Absolutely. But we need to be strategic. Your aunt tried going to institutions, historical societies, universities, media outlets. They all shut her down because they have corporate donors and political pressures. We need to build this story from the ground up, creating a coalition that can't be silenced." Dr. Reyes pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. "First, we need to find the other descendants. Your aunt started that work, let's finish it. Second, we need to document everything with multiple redundancies. Third, we need legal representation. And fourth, we need to go public in a way that makes it impossible to suppress the story. How do we do that? Social media, independent journalism, direct outreach to descendant communities. We bypass the traditional gatekeepers entirely. Once the story is out there, widely distributed and documented, it becomes much harder to suppress." Elena felt hope rising in her chest. "My aunt left me $50,000. She said to use it to finish what she started." Dr. Reyes nodded approvingly. "Good. We'll need some of that for legal fees, archival work, and travel to meet with descendants. But Elena, I need you to understand something, this fight will get harder before it gets easier. The people who fired you, who sent you threats, they won't stop. They'll escalate." "I know," Elena said. "But I can't walk away. Not after seeing what my great-grandmother and the others went through. Not after learning how hard my aunt fought to preserve their stories." "Then let's build an army," Dr. Reyes said with a slight smile. Because that's what it's going to take. Finding the descendants. Over the next 2 weeks, Elena and Dr. Reyes worked around the clock to locate the descendants of the 37 Pullman maids. Rosa's research had provided starting points, names, last known addresses, family trees, but much of the information was years old and needed updating. They divided the work. Dr. Reyes used her academic connections to search historical records and genealogical databases. Elena used social media and online search tools, tracking down possible descendants through public records, obituaries, and family trees posted on ancestry websites. It was painstaking work, but gradually they began making connections. The first descendant they located was Maria Gonzalez, a 68-year-old retired teacher living in Tucson. Her grandmother, Carmen Gonzalez, had been one of the arrested maids. Maria broke down crying when Elena called and explained what they'd discovered. "My grandmother never talked about it," Maria said through tears. "She died when I was young, but I remember her having nightmares. My mother said something terrible had happened to her on the trains, but nobody ever explained what. I've always wondered." Maria agreed to meet with them, and when she saw the documentation, including a photograph of her grandmother standing with the other maids beside car number 47, she committed immediately to joining their effort. "My grandmother deserves to be remembered," Maria said firmly. "They all do. Whatever you need from me, you have it." The second descendant was Roberto Mendoza, a 45-year-old attorney in Los Angeles whose great-aunt Sofia Mendoza had been among the deported maids. Roberto was immediately interested not just personally but professionally. "I specialize in civil rights litigation," he told Elena during their phone call. "This case has significant legal implications. The companies that profited from illegal deportations and wage theft should be held accountable, even if it happened 95 years ago." Roberto offered to represent the descendants pro bono, seeing it as both a personal mission and an important civil rights case. Over the following weeks, Elena and Dr. Reyes located 17 more descendants, scattered across Arizona, California, Texas, New Mexico, and even as far as Illinois and New York. Each had a similar story: a grandmother or great-grandmother who'd worked on the trains, who'd been mysteriously fired or disappeared, whose story had been buried by family silence or lost to time. Some descendants had suspected something traumatic had happened but had never known the details. Others had been told fragments of the story but had thought it was family legend rather than documented history. All of them, without exception, wanted to be part of bringing the truth to light. The documentary. Dr. Reyes had a colleague, an independent documentary filmmaker named James Chen who specialized in historical justice stories. When she showed him Elena's materials, he immediately committed to creating a documentary about the car number 47 incident. "This is exactly the kind of suppressed history that needs to be told," James said during their first meeting. "And the fact that you have the actual train car, the physical evidence, the testimony, this is a filmmaker's dream." James began filming immediately. He interviewed Elena about discovering the evidence. He traveled to Maricopa to film the train car itself, capturing its restored beauty and the hidden compartment where Rosa had preserved the documents. He interviewed Dr. Reyes about the historical context. And most importantly, he interviewed the descendants who'd been located, documenting their emotional responses to learning their family stories. The most powerful footage came from a gathering James organized at the rail yard. Elena had invited all the descendants they'd located to come see car number 47 together. 18 people, ranging in age from their 30s to their 80s, stood in front of the burgundy train car where their grandmothers and great-grandmothers had worked, had planned their courageous action, and had been arrested. Many wept. Some stood in silence, processing decades of family trauma finally given context and meaning. Others wanted to touch the train car, to stand where their ancestors had stood, to connect physically with a history they'd never fully understood. James captured all of it: the tears, the anger, the solidarity forming among people who'd been strangers but were now united by shared history and shared purpose. The legal action. Roberto Mendoza worked with Elena and Dr. Reyes to build a comprehensive legal case. They weren't seeking monetary damages, the statute of limitations had long passed for that. Instead, they sought something more profound: official acknowledgement, public apology, and symbolic reparations from the successor companies. The legal filing targeted Union Pacific Railroad, successor to Southern Pacific, and demanded public acknowledgement of the 1929 arrests and deportations, official apology to the descendants of the affected workers, establishment of a memorial fund for educational scholarships for descendants, historical preservation of car number 47 as a national monument, inclusion of this history in the company's official historical records. The filing was meticulously documented with Rosa's 20 years of research, making it nearly impossible to dismiss as frivolous or unsubstantiated. When Roberto filed the case in federal court, he simultaneously released it to the media, not to traditional outlets that might suppress it, but to independent journalists, Latino media organizations, and social media platforms where it couldn't be controlled. The story goes viral. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 48 hours of Roberto's filing going public, the car number 47 story had exploded across social media. The combination of compelling human interest, Elena's discovery in the train car walls, and historical injustice created the perfect viral narrative. Latino advocacy organizations shared the story widely. Labor unions highlighted it as part of a broader history of worker exploitation. Civil rights groups connected it to ongoing immigration debates. Historians praised Rosa's meticulous research and mourned that mainstream institutions had ignored her work for 2 decades. James Chen's documentary footage, released in segments on YouTube and other platforms, garnered millions of views. The image of Elena standing beside the restored train car, holding her great-grandmother's photograph, became iconic. Traditional media outlets, seeing the story's momentum, finally covered it, though many framed it as the viral story everyone's talking about rather than taking responsibility for having ignored it when Rosa had approached them years earlier. Union Pacific Railroad initially responded with a terse statement through their legal department, essentially repeating what they'd told Rosa in 2019. They couldn't comment on events from nearly a century ago under different corporate ownership. But the public backlash was fierce. Social media campaigns demanded accountability. Protests organized outside Union Pacific corporate offices. Several major shareholders questioned the company's handling of the situation. Within 2 weeks, Union Pacific changed its position. The acknowledgement. The company announced it would commission an independent historical investigation into the 1929 incident, conducted by a panel of respected historians not affiliated with the railroad industry. They agreed to preserve car number 47 and work with Elena and the descendants to create an appropriate memorial. Most significantly, the company's CEO issued a public statement that, while carefully worded by lawyers, represented the acknowledgement Elena had sought. Union Pacific Railroad acknowledges that serious injustices occurred during the operation of the Southern Pacific Railroad line in 1929, including the treatment of Mexican and Mexican-American workers who were subjected to discriminatory labor practices, unlawful arrests, and deportations. While these events occurred under different ownership and management nearly a century ago, we recognize that the impact on affected families has echoed through generations. We commit to working with descendants and historians to ensure this history is properly documented, remembered, and honored. It wasn't perfect. It was corporate and legalistic. But it was acknowledgement. For the first time in 95 years, a major institution had officially recognized what had happened to Guadalupe Torres and the 36 other Pullman maids. The memorial. 6 months after Elena first opened that document box in the train car, she stood once again beside car number 47. But this time, she wasn't alone. Hundreds of people had gathered at the rail yard in Maricopa, descendants of the 37 maids, community members, historians, activists, and reporters. The train car had been moved to a prominent location and would become the centerpiece of a new memorial and museum dedicated to Mexican-American railroad workers. Elena stood at a podium beside the train car, looking out at the crowd. Her mother was there. They'd reconciled slowly, painfully, over the previous months. Maria Torres still believed Elena had made things harder than necessary, but she'd come to understand why her daughter couldn't walk away from this fight. Dr. Reyes stood beside Elena, having guided her through every step of this journey. Roberto Mendoza was there with several of the descendants he'd come to know as clients and friends. Frank Castellano, the rail yard manager, had tears streaming down his face as he watched Rosa's 20-year dream finally realized. Elena held a framed photograph, her great-grandmother Guadalupe, standing proud in her Pullman-made uniform. She thought about all the women in that photograph of the car number 47 crew from August 1929. Women who'd asked for dignity and been punished. Women whose courage had been deliberately forgotten. Not anymore. My Aunt Rosa spent 20 years preserving the truth that powerful people wanted to bury, Elena said into the microphone, her voice steady. My great-grandmother Guadalupe spent her life carrying the trauma of injustice that was never acknowledged. Today, we finally honor their courage and the courage of all 37 women who stood up for their rights 95 years ago. She paused, looking at the train car that had started everything. The truth was in the walls. And now the truth is in the light, where it belongs. These women will not be forgotten. Their story will be told. And their courage will inspire future generations to keep fighting for justice, no matter how long it takes. The crowd erupted in applause. Elena stepped back from the podium, tears streaming down her face, as a choir began singing, a song in Spanish about memory, justice, and the power of truth. Later, after the ceremony concluded, Elena stood alone inside car number 47. She ran her hand along the mahogany paneling where she'd found the hidden compartment, thinking about the journey that had started here. She'd lost her job, strained her relationship with her mother, and faced threats from powerful interests. But she'd also found her purpose. She'd honored her aunt's legacy. She'd given her great-grandmother's courage the recognition it deserved. And she'd helped create a movement that would ensure this history would never be forgotten again. The train car that had once carried 37 women toward an act of courage that would be punished and buried now carried their story forward into the light of historical memory. Rosa had been right, some things were worth more than money or safety or comfort. Some truths demanded to be told, regardless of the cost. And the Torres women, stubborn, brave, and determined, had made sure this truth would finally, after 95 years, be heard. The end. Thank you for following Elena's incredible journey. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and share it with others. Stories like these, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things to honor their ancestors and fight for justice, deserve to be remembered and celebrated. Drop a comment below telling us, what family story do you think deserves to be brought into the light? Your story might inspire our next video. And remember, the truth is always in the walls, waiting for someone brave enough to find it.